It began with a conversation few people were supposed to hear. Behind closed doors at Kensington Palace, senior aides, legal advisors, and trusted family members gathered for what was described as a routine discussion. Yet within hours, whispers spread across royal circles that Princess Charlotte had been quietly linked to a property long considered untouchable. What sounded like another palace rumor soon exploded into a story that threatened to reopen old family divisions. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. At first, the reports seemed almost too strange to believe. Royal households are constantly surrounded by speculation, and unusual claims emerge every week. But this story refused to disappear. Instead, it grew larger with every passing day. According to sources familiar with palace operations, a confidential meeting involving Prince William, Princess Catherine, and a team of legal advisors had taken place under an unusual level of secrecy. That alone was enough to attract attention. Meetings concerning family estates are not uncommon. What was uncommon was the silence that followed. Normally, palace representatives move quickly to calm rumors before they gain momentum. This time, however, there was no immediate denial. No clarification, no reassuring statement. The silence itself became part of the mystery. As journalists, commentators, and royal watchers searched for answers, one detail surfaced again and again. The discussion reportedly centered on a historic royal cottage, a residence rarely mentioned publicly but known among royal insiders as one of the most sensitive properties connected to the family's private legacy. Some described it as charming, others called it symbolic. But those closest to the story used a different word altogether: forbidden. That single description transformed what might have been an ordinary inheritance discussion into something much bigger. Why would a cottage be considered forbidden? What made it different from countless other royal residences scattered across Britain? And why was Princess Charlotte suddenly being connected to it now? The questions only multiplied when estate records reportedly began attracting unusual attention. Observers who closely follow royal property management claimed that activity surrounding several internal documents appeared to increase. Nothing was officially confirmed, yet the timing seemed impossible to ignore. The same week whispers about Charlotte emerged. Conversations surrounding the cottage appeared to intensify behind palace walls. Then came the rumor that truly ignited public fascination. According to growing speculation, Charlotte was not simply being considered for a future inheritance. She was being positioned as the preferred recipient. If true, that would represent a remarkable development. Yet even more astonishing were claims that another potential claimant had quietly been removed from consideration before any public announcement could occur. Suddenly, what began as a property story became something far more emotional. Questions about legacy turned into questions about family. Questions about tradition turned into questions about succession, and questions about inheritance turned into questions about who belonged within the future vision of the monarchy itself. The palace remained silent. That silence allowed every new theory to gain strength. Some believed the reports were exaggerated. Others argued that the lack of denial spoke volumes. Royal commentators, who had spent years covering the family, admitted that something felt different this time. The atmosphere surrounding the story carried an unusual weight. It felt less like gossip and more like the early stages of a revelation. And at the center of it all stood Princess Charlotte, a young royal whose future role within the monarchy continues to grow with every passing year. Whether she expected it or not, her name had become attached to one of the most mysterious inheritance stories in recent royal memory. But the mystery wasn't simply about a cottage. It was about why this particular property had remained off-limits for so many years. For decades, the small royal cottage sat in near silence, tucked away from public attention and surrounded by stories that palace insiders rarely discussed. While grand palaces attracted headlines, this modest residence carried a legacy that made it far more significant than its size suggested. The deeper royal watchers dug into the mystery, the more unusual the cottage's history appeared. On paper, it seemed insignificant compared to the vast estates, historic castles, and famous residences that dominate discussions about the monarchy. Yet those who understood the private traditions of the royal family knew that some properties carried a value that could never be measured in money alone. This cottage was one of them. Its story stretched back through multiple generations, becoming woven into the personal history of the House of Windsor itself. Long before the current generation of royals entered public life, the residence had reportedly served as a quiet refuge for members of the family, during some of their most difficult moments. While official records revealed little, palace circles preserved stories that were passed down over the years. These stories spoke of private conversations, important decisions, and deeply personal memories connected to the property. Over time, the cottage became something more than a residence. It became a symbol. That symbolism was precisely what made the property so sensitive. Unlike many royal assets that could be openly transferred, renovated, or reassigned, this particular cottage seemed to exist under a different set of expectations. According to long-standing royal whispers, informal agreements surrounding its future had existed for years. No public document confirmed these claims, yet the stories persisted generation after generation. Family members reportedly understood that the cottage represented a special connection to the royal bloodline itself, making decisions about its future far more complicated than outsiders realized. As these stories resurfaced, attention focused on one phrase that appeared repeatedly in discussions surrounding the property: forbidden. The label fascinated observers because it suggested something far deeper than ordinary family tradition. Properties are not usually described in such dramatic terms. Yet according to those familiar with royal lore, the cottage earned its reputation because certain boundaries had always surrounded it. Some believed previous attempts to decide its future had repeatedly stalled behind closed doors. Others claimed that sensitive family concerns had prevented definitive action for years. Whatever the truth, one pattern appeared undeniable. Every time the question of inheritance emerged, the issue somehow remained unresolved. That uncertainty only increased the property's mystique. Over the years, royal commentators occasionally speculated about who might eventually inherit the residence. Most assumptions followed a familiar path. Because of its symbolic importance, many believed the cottage would remain within the direct line of succession. It was not viewed as a reward, nor as a financial asset. Instead, it was seen as a responsibility, a continuation of a legacy, a quiet acknowledgement of a place within the monarchy's future. That belief gradually became accepted wisdom among those who followed royal affairs closely. The cottage's emotional value far exceeded its market value. While other properties represented wealth, status, or prestige, this residence represented continuity. It connected the present generation to those who came before them, and perhaps more importantly, to those who would come after. Yet for all its significance, the cottage remained largely forgotten by the wider public. Interest only began growing when Princess Charlotte's name unexpectedly entered the conversation. Suddenly, details that had remained hidden for decades were being discussed openly. Historians revisited old stories. Commentators analyzed forgotten traditions. Questions that had lingered unanswered for years returned with new urgency. And with every new revelation, one realization became impossible to ignore. The mystery was no longer centered on the cottage itself. The focus was shifting toward the person reportedly chosen to inherit it. As the cottage's history came into focus, attention quickly shifted toward the question everyone was asking: why Charlotte? When Princess Charlotte's name reportedly appeared in discussions about the cottage, even seasoned royal observers were stunned. This wasn't simply about property ownership. It was about what her selection might signal regarding the monarchy's long-term vision for the next generation. Until that moment, much of the conversation had focused on the cottage itself, its history, its symbolism, its mysterious reputation within royal circles. But suddenly the property became secondary. The real story was no longer about where the cottage stood or what memories it contained. The real story was about why Princess Charlotte had become connected to it in the first place. The question spread rapidly through royal circles because Charlotte occupies a position unlike almost anyone else in the modern monarchy. She is not the heir. She is not expected to wear the crown one day. Yet she remains one of the most important figures in the royal family's future. As the daughter of Prince William and Princess Catherine, she stands at the center of the next generation, positioned between royal tradition and a rapidly changing public image. That unique position has made her one of the most closely watched young royals in the world. Over the past several years, public fascination with Charlotte has grown steadily. What began as simple curiosity evolved into something far more significant. Royal commentators frequently noted her confidence, composure, and apparent understanding of royal expectations despite her young age. Every public appearance generated discussion. Every interaction attracted attention. Slowly, a narrative began forming around her future role within the monarchy. That narrative only intensified as whispers surrounding the cottage continued to spread. According to growing speculation, senior members of the royal household may view Charlotte as a particularly important figure in the monarchy's long-term stability. While the future king will eventually emerge from the direct line of succession, royal institutions often rely upon influential supporting figures who help preserve continuity across generations. Throughout history, some of the monarchy's most respected women never wore the crown themselves, yet their influence shaped entire eras. That comparison began appearing more frequently as analysts examined Charlotte's reported connection to the property. Many observers pointed toward previous royal women whose importance extended far beyond their official titles. They became symbols of stability during periods of uncertainty. They protected family traditions while adapting to changing times. They provided continuity when circumstances threatened disruption. The more commentators explored Charlotte's growing role, the more they began wondering whether the cottage represented something similar. Because perhaps this inheritance was never intended as a simple gift. Perhaps it was a signal, a statement, a carefully considered acknowledgement of the role Charlotte may someday play within the institution itself. That possibility transformed public interest into genuine fascination. If the cottage carried the symbolic weight many believed it did, then Charlotte's reported selection suddenly seemed far more meaningful. The residence was no longer being viewed as property. It was being viewed as a marker of trust, a connection between generations, a bridge linking royal history to royal future. Yet for every theory that emerged, new questions followed. How exactly had this decision been reached? Who participated in the discussions? Were senior royals united behind the reported choice, or had disagreements occurred behind closed doors? Why had the story remained hidden for so long? And perhaps most importantly, why was information beginning to surface now rather than years earlier? The absence of answers only fueled further speculation. Media attention intensified as commentators attempted to piece together fragments of information from multiple sources. Some suggested that internal planning for the monarchy's future had accelerated. Others believed the reports reflected broader efforts to strengthen the next generation's public standing. Whatever the explanation, one reality had become impossible to ignore. Charlotte's reported connection to the cottage had elevated a quiet inheritance story into a major controversy, and just as the public began focusing entirely on Charlotte's unexpected role, another development emerged from the shadows. A second name began appearing in discussions, a name capable of transforming an already sensitive story into something far more dramatic. Yet Charlotte's reported inheritance became even more explosive once another name entered the conversation. As excitement surrounding Charlotte grew, a second narrative began emerging behind the scenes. According to Palace Whispers, another potential connection to the cottage had quietly been examined and ultimately rejected before it ever became public. At first, the rumors appeared scattered and difficult to verify. Small fragments surfaced through royal commentators, anonymous sources, and increasingly intense speculation across royal watcher circles. Yet despite the uncertainty, a pattern gradually began taking shape. The conversation surrounding Charlotte's reported inheritance was no longer unfolding in isolation. Another possibility had apparently existed in the background, one that some believed had briefly entered private discussions before disappearing, almost as quickly as it emerged. That possibility centered on Lilibet. The mere mention of her name transformed the atmosphere surrounding the story. What had previously been viewed as an intriguing inheritance mystery suddenly evolved into something far more sensitive. The cottage was no longer being discussed solely as a symbol of royal continuity. It was becoming linked to larger questions about family divisions, succession traditions, and the increasingly complicated relationships that have defined recent years within the monarchy. As speculation intensified, reports began suggesting that competing expectations may have existed regarding the property's future. No official source confirmed such claims, yet the persistence of the rumors kept drawing attention. Some commentators argued that various possibilities had been reviewed during private consultations. Others believed the discussions reflected broader conversations about the future structure of the royal family itself. Whatever the truth, the growing debate exposed just how emotionally charged the issue had become. For supporters of different branches of the family, the cottage represented far more than bricks and land. It became a symbol of belonging, recognition, legacy. Every new rumor appeared to carry deeper implications than the one before it. Questions about inheritance quickly transformed into questions about identity. Who would carry certain traditions forward? Who remained connected to royal history, and who, if anyone, stood outside those expectations? Behind palace walls, according to persistent whispers, discussions reportedly became increasingly delicate. Advisors were said to be approaching the issue with extraordinary caution, not because of the cottage itself, but because of what any decision surrounding it might communicate to the public. In an institution built upon symbolism, even a small inheritance can generate enormous consequences. That reality reportedly pushed legal experts into the center of the conversation. As speculation spread, reports emerged that advisors had been reviewing various succession-related considerations connected to historical inheritance practices. While few details surfaced publicly, commentators increasingly focused on the distinction between personal family decisions and long-standing royal customs. The conversation became less emotional and more procedural, less about preference and more about precedent. Yet those explanations did little to calm public fascination. If anything, they created even more questions. Observers began wondering whether certain inheritances were governed by traditions invisible to the wider public. Could historical expectations influence modern decisions? Did symbolic properties follow different rules than ordinary assets? And if so, who ultimately decided where those boundaries existed? The lack of clear answers fueled endless debate. Media outlets attempted to piece together conflicting information from multiple sources. Some reports emphasized Charlotte's future position within the monarchy. Others focused on the broader family implications. Every article, discussion panel, and commentary segment seemed to introduce a new interpretation. The result was a growing sense that the public was only seeing a small piece of a much larger story. Meanwhile, royal watcher communities became increasingly divided. Opinions formed rapidly, theories multiplied. Every new rumor generated another wave of discussion. What began as a quiet inheritance question had evolved into one of the most closely followed royal controversies in recent memory. And as investigators continued pulling at the threads, a surprising realization began to emerge. The cottage may have sparked the debate, but the forces shaping the decision appeared far larger than anyone initially suspected. The deeper investigators looked, the clearer it became that the decision involved far more than family sentiment. Behind every royal inheritance lies a maze of traditions, agreements, and legal frameworks, and according to those following the story closely, it was these little-known rules that may have ultimately determined the cottage's future. As public debate intensified, attention gradually shifted away from rumors and towards something far more powerful inside the monarchy. Precedent for generations, royal institutions have relied on customs that often remain invisible to the public. While headlines frequently focus on personalities and family disagreements, the reality behind many royal decisions is often shaped by layers of historical practice stretching back decades, sometimes even centuries. The deeper observers examined the cottage controversy, the more they began to suspect that this was not merely a family discussion. It was a question of tradition confronting modern expectations. That realization changed everything. Suddenly, analysts were no longer asking who wanted the cottage. They were asking which rules governed it. According to reports circulating among royal commentators, palace advisors had reportedly spent considerable time reviewing the property's status. Was it simply a personal family asset, or did it carry a broader institutional significance connected to the monarchy itself? The distinction mattered enormously, because different categories of royal property often follow very different expectations regarding inheritance. This is where the story became increasingly complicated. Throughout royal history, there has often been a clear separation between private possessions and assets viewed as part of the monarchy's continuing legacy. Some properties are treated as personal residences that can be passed according to family wishes. Others become symbols of continuity, carrying obligations that extend beyond individual preferences. According to growing speculation, many of the discussions surrounding the cottage may have focused on precisely this distinction. If the property was viewed primarily as a family asset, one set of considerations would apply. If it was viewed as a symbolic extension of royal heritage, entirely different expectations could come into play. That possibility immediately elevated the importance of every legal review reportedly taking place behind the scenes. Commentators began suggesting that advisors were examining historical records, previous inheritance arrangements, and long-standing customs that might influence the final outcome. No official details emerged, yet the persistence of these reports suggested that the issue was being treated with unusual seriousness. As more theories surfaced, Another question moved to the center of the conversation: eligibility. Who qualifies for certain symbolic inheritances? Which traditions still carry weight in the modern monarchy? How much influence does precedent exert when sensitive decisions arise? These questions generated endless discussion because they touched upon one of the monarchy's most fundamental principles: the preservation of continuity across generations. For many observers, that continuity appeared increasingly connected to the direct royal line. Experts discussing royal customs frequently emphasize that symbolic assets often serve purposes beyond simple ownership. They reinforce connections between generations. They strengthen institutional identity. They provide tangible links between past, present, and future. If the cottage truly carried the historical significance many believed it did, then preserving those connections may have become a major factor in determining its future. The more this perspective gained traction, the more inevitable the reported decision began to seem. What initially appeared controversial slowly started looking consistent with broader royal traditions. Observers who had once viewed Charlotte's reported inheritance as surprising began reconsidering their assumptions. If advisors were following established precedent, perhaps the outcome was less shocking than it first appeared. Perhaps the controversy existed not because the decision was unusual, but because the symbolism surrounding it was so powerful. Yet while legal interpretations and historical customs offered possible explanations, they failed to answer another mystery that continued haunting the story. Because behind every legal review stood real people. Behind every tradition stood real emotions, and according to persistent palace whispers, the reactions unfolding behind closed doors suggested that something far more personal was at stake. But legal arguments alone could not explain the emotional reactions reportedly unfolding behind palace walls. While lawyers focused on rules and paperwork, family members were reportedly dealing with something far more personal. Behind the polished image of royal unity, emotions were said to be running higher than anyone expected. For weeks, much of the public conversation had revolved around legal customs, inheritance traditions, and historical precedent. Those topics helped explain how a decision might be reached, but they could not explain why the story continued generating such intense interest. The answer, according to many observers, was simple. This was never just about a cottage. It was about people. It was about relationships. It was about the hopes, expectations, and disappointments that often remain hidden behind palace walls. As speculation surrounding Charlotte's reported inheritance continued to grow, attention increasingly shifted toward the family members believed to be closest to the situation. Among them, Prince William and Princess Catherine remained at the center of the discussion. According to persistent royal whispers, both were viewed as deeply committed to protecting Charlotte's future role within the monarchy. Whether those reports were accurate or not, they aligned with a broader perception that the Prince and Princess of Wales have spent years carefully preparing their children for the regub, responsibilities that may one day accompany their positions. That perspective added an emotional dimension to the story that legal arguments alone could never provide. If the cottage truly represented a symbolic inheritance rather than a simple property transfer, then Charlotte's connection to it carried enormous significance. Supporters of the reported decision argued that preserving important traditions required careful planning and long-term thinking. Critics questioned whether symbolism should outweigh broader family considerations. Neither side appeared willing to surrender its position easily. As a result, discussions reportedly became increasingly sensitive. According to royal commentators, palace aides found themselves facing a difficult challenge. Every new rumor generated another wave of headlines. Every headline generated additional speculation. Every round of speculation intensified public curiosity. Containing the story became almost impossible because the more information remained unavailable, the more people wanted answers. Inside royal circles, the atmosphere was said to be growing increasingly complicated. Questions about inheritance gradually evolved into questions about future relationships. What would the reported decision mean for family dynamics moving forward? Could old tensions become more difficult to heal? Would the controversy fade once official clarification emerged, or had something deeper already been exposed? These concerns lingered over every discussion, creating an undercurrent of uncertainty that seemed impossible to ignore. At the same time, public sympathy began forming around different interpretations of the story. Some observers viewed Charlotte as a young royal unexpectedly placed at the center of a controversy she never sought. Others focused on broader questions of fairness and inclusion. Still others argued that long-standing royal customs should be respected regardless of public opinion. As debates intensified across media platforms and royal watcher communities, it became increasingly clear that people were no longer discussing a property. They were discussing competing visions of what the monarchy should represent. That shift transformed the cottage into something far larger than anyone originally imagined. What had once been an obscure residence known mainly to royal insiders was now being treated as a symbol of competing values: tradition versus change, continuity versus adaptation, legacy versus expectation. Every new discussion seemed to reinforce the idea that the controversy had become a reflection of broader tensions already present within the royal family. And perhaps that was why emotions reportedly ran so high. Because beneath every theory, every headline, and every whispered conversation lay a simple reality. Decisions involving legacy are rarely confined to the past, they shape the future as well. As observers watched the story unfold, many began realizing that its consequences could extend far beyond one cottage and one inheritance. The questions being raised today could influence how the public viewed the monarchy's next chapter for years to come. As tensions grew, observers began realizing that this story could reshape perceptions of the next royal generation. The cottage may be small, but the message behind it is anything but. To many royal commentators, the reported inheritance decision offers a glimpse into how the monarchy intends to navigate the decades ahead. By this point, the conversation had moved far beyond questions of ownership. The debate was no longer centered on who might receive a particular property. Instead, attention had shifted toward what the reported decision could reveal about the future direction of the royal family itself. Every new discussion seemed to point toward the same conclusion. The cottage had become a symbol of something much larger than anyone originally anticipated. At the center of that symbolism stood Princess Charlotte. For years, public interest in Charlotte had steadily grown alongside her visibility within the royal family. Yet the inheritance controversy appeared to elevate that interest to an entirely different level. Royal commentators who once viewed her primarily as an important member of the next generation were now discussing her as a potentially influential figure in the monarchy's long-term future. Whether those predictions prove accurate remains uncertain, but the conversation itself revealed how dramatically perceptions had begun to shift. Many observers argued that Charlotte represents something uniquely valuable to the institution. She occupies a position that allows her to bridge multiple generations of royal history. She belongs to the future while remaining connected to traditions that stretch far into the past. In a monarchy that depends heavily on continuity, such figures often carry significance far beyond their official rank. That reality helped explain why the reported inheritance attracted so much attention. The discussion also fueled growing interest in the broader role of the next generation of working royals. Questions that once seemed distant suddenly felt immediate. How would the monarchy evolve over the coming decades? Which family members would become central to its public image? What values would define the institution as younger royals gradually assume greater responsibilities? These questions became impossible to separate from the cottage controversy. Analysts increasingly debated the importance of symbolic inheritances and the messages they communicate. While financial assets can be measured and quantified, symbolic inheritances often carry deeper meaning. They express trust, they reflect priorities, they reveal how institutions view their own future. For that reason, many commentators argued that the significance of the reported decision had little to do with the property's market value and everything to do with its symbolic weight. As media coverage expanded, public fascination with succession planning also intensified. Ordinarily, discussions about future generations unfold slowly and largely outside public attention. This story changed that. Suddenly, millions of people were debating how the monarchy prepares for the future. The cottage became a focal point for larger conversations about continuity, legacy, and long-term stability. Every headline seemed to generate another round of questions about where the institution was heading and who would help guide it there. The result was a remarkable transformation in public perception. What began as a quiet inheritance rumor had evolved into a broader examination of the monarchy's future identity. Discussions about property became discussions about purpose. Debates about inheritance became debates about legacy. Even individuals who paid little attention to royal affairs found themselves drawn into questions about what the next chapter of the monarchy might look like. Meanwhile, royal insiders continued hinting that additional implications could still emerge. Some suggested that the cottage story represented only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Others believed it reflected ongoing efforts to strengthen connections between royal traditions and future generations. Whether those suggestions prove accurate remains unknown, but they added yet another layer of intrigue to an already extraordinary story. And perhaps that lingering uncertainty explains why public fascination has refused to fade. Because despite everything that has already been revealed, many observers believe the most important truth remains hidden beneath the surface. The inheritance itself may have captured headlines, but another discovery was beginning to attract even greater attention. And yet the most surprising revelation wasn't the inheritance itself, was what the cottage had represented all along. In the end, the story was never just about a cottage. It was about legacy, symbolism, and the quiet decisions that shape royal history long before the public learns they exist. What appeared to be a simple inheritance had become a powerful statement about the future of the crown. As the controversy continued unfolding, many observers reached the same conclusion. The cottage itself was never the true story. Its walls, its location, and even its value mattered far less than what it represented. Throughout royal history, certain properties have carried meanings that extend beyond ownership. They become markers of continuity. They become links between generations. They become symbols of trust placed in those expected to carry traditions forward. According to growing speculation, that may have been exactly why this inheritance attracted such extraordinary attention. For months, public discussion focused on who might receive the property. Yet as more information surfaced, a different interpretation began gaining momentum. The reported decision increasingly appeared to fit within a broader legacy strategy. Rather than representing a simple family arrangement, Charlotte's connection to the cottage was viewed by many commentators as part of a much larger effort to reinforce continuity within the next generation of the monarchy. That perspective dramatically changed how people viewed the controversy. Suddenly, the cottage was no longer being discussed as a residence. It was being discussed as a message about the future, a message about priorities, a message about which values the institution hopes to preserve as it moves into a new era. Whether those interpretations are ultimately proven correct remains uncertain, but they explain why the story continued generating intense public fascination long after the initial rumors emerged. At the same time, debate surrounding the reported blocking of another claim refused to disappear. If anything, that aspect of the story continued fueling even greater speculation. Every unanswered question seemed to generate three more. Why were certain possibilities reportedly considered and then dismissed? What discussions took place behind closed doors? Who ultimately influenced the outcome? Because official clarification remained limited, the absence of answers became almost as powerful as the information itself. Palace silence deepened the mystery. In many ways, that silence became one of the most important characters in the story. Every refusal to comment encouraged additional theories. Every unanswered question increased public curiosity. Every attempt to move attention elsewhere seemed only to strengthen fascination with the issue. The result was a controversy that refused to fade, even as new royal stories emerged. Royal historians also began drawing comparisons to inheritance debates from previous generations. While every era faces its own challenges, history repeatedly demonstrates that symbolic decisions often generate the strongest reactions. Time and again, seemingly small choices reveal deeper institutional priorities. Looking back, many of the monarchy's most significant transitions were not announced through dramatic declarations. They were communicated through quiet decisions whose importance became clear only years later. That historical perspective encouraged many observers to view the cottage story through a very different lens. As a result, the next generation's role within the monarchy appeared clearer than ever before. Charlotte's reported inheritance became part of a larger conversation about continuity, responsibility, and the future image of the crown. It highlighted how carefully the institution manages symbols, traditions, and expectations. More importantly, it reminded the public that royal history is often shaped long before major events become visible to the outside world. Yet even now, many questions remain unanswered. If one symbolic decision generated this much attention, what other discussions may currently be taking place behind palace walls? What future plans remain hidden from public view? Which decisions being made today will only reveal their significance years from now? Those mysteries continue lingering over the story, ensuring that public fascination is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Because perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire controversy is not what became public, but what remains unseen. The cottage may have provided a rare glimpse into the monarchy's thinking, but few believe it revealed the complete picture. Somewhere beyond the headlines, beyond the speculation, and beyond the official statements, the next chapter of royal history is already being written. Because in the royal family, the most important battles are rarely fought in public. They are decided quietly behind palace doors, where legacy always outweighs sentiment. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.